In the antebellum age, as intellectuals and writers stressed different options to society, different and alternative lifestyles and utopian communities and so forth, there were others that stressed active reform of society. Rather than going away, they stressed addressing the problems of society, trying to change it or mold it or improve it. And that's the subject of this video here. One of the most obvious of the reform movements were women's efforts to gain equal rights. And certainly the Industrial Revolution really shaped this movement. In one sense, the Industrial Revolution exploited women, but in another sense, it increased their economic independence and power. Think of the outwork system, which directly gave women money. And while the factory workers, women weren't paid much, they were at least removed from the home and learning to earn a wage. With more money and independence, middle-class women, say from about 1820 to 1860, began to expand what the idea of womanhood was. Now, initially, womanhood was what the realm of women was the family, the nuclear family and the home. But for the first time, they began to speak of a women's sphere, which related to things outside the home. It was still things that were related to the home, the traditional women's roles, but they weren't just limited to the nuclear family. They began to get into things like education and that type of thing, which had revolved around the nuclear family for before. Of course, the Second Great Awakening, which definitely grew out of the Industrial Revolution in the antebellum age, it was stressed the role of women, and I think the Second Great Awakening sort of instilled women with an evangelical fervor, that it really motivated them, and but it's part of the broader picture here. They first focused on moral reforms, ending prostitution and punishing those who had sexual behavior that they thought violated the Ten Commandments. The movement began in New York when a group of middle-class women founded the New York Female Moral Reform Society. And by 1837, the New York Society had 15,000 members and over 250 chapters. With the success of the New York Society, members sought to expand nationally, and they created the American Female Moral Reform Society in 1840, and that also thrived. It had 550 chapters, but it was interesting, there was not much success in the South. Members went to brothels where they stood outside and sang Christian hymns and prayers and searched for runaway daughters, and they would mark down the name of the men, the Johns, who were going to the prostitutes. They also lobbied on state laws regulating sexual behavior. They even tried to make seduction of women a crime. And they were successful to an extent in New York and Massachusetts. Soon women began to focus more on reforming other social institutions, most notably asylums, hospitals, and jails. They began visiting such institutions in the 1830s and 1840s, and they were really appalled by the conditions they saw there. The most accomplished of these female reformers was Dorothea Dix. In 1841, she visited jail in Cambridge, Massachusetts, as a Sunday school teacher for the women who were locked up there. But, she was outraged that many of the women inside were clearly mentally disturbed, and yet they were put in with the general criminal population. And so she began a 2-year investigation in the way such women, were treated and housed. And her report prompted Massachusetts to make changes separating insane women and better treating them. And this, of course, in turn led to a national jail reform movement, a national asylum reform movement. She became famous, and she traveled over 30,000 miles lecturing between 1843 and 1854. She did get a national reform bill passed Congress, but the President Franklin Pierce vetoed it, saying it was too expensive. About that same time, women began to focus on reform of a natural concern for women, as I've said before, education. The concern nationally was increased simply because of movements like Transcendentalism and its emphasis on individual self-awareness. The movement once again began with middle-class women in New York and Massachusetts who organized efforts to expand and standardize public school education. In Massachusetts in 1837, women pressed for the appointment of Horace Mann to a new state board of education they had pushed to create. Mann was a transcendentalist and a brother-in-law of Nathaniel Hawthorne. Obviously, by the way, they couldn't get a woman in that position, so Mann was the best they could do. The most important thing Mann focused on was replacing the untrained, highly mobile young men who had moved around and dominated the teaching profession, and he was stressing to get better educated and more stable, and in Mann's view, more moral young women. They would be trained and they would stay longer, and they're more naturally moral, and that was what Mann advocated, and so the women really supported him. Mann soon became famous for creating the first real modern apparatus of public school. He created a state normal school to teach teachers, and so of course the other states soon adopted this, and you get the things like the roots of Southeastern Oklahoma State University as a normal school. They also pushed for more rigid state standards for teachers, as well as better pay to make it more attractive for these women. He pushed for essentially teachers organizations, kind of like a union, and that actually would lobby for better conditions for these women and get better qualified teachers. With Mann and his reforms, thousands of middle-class women took advantage of this new opportunity to move into teaching. And their overall intellectual leader was a woman named Katherine Beecher. Beecher founded several academies for young women, working to better prepare the next generation of women and continue the reforms from generation to generation. Beecher argued that women should have a special commitment to education because traditionally women had the main obligation for moral development. By 1850, public education had expanded throughout much of the North and was largely staffed now by women. Also, children in 1850 received, on average, more than 400 days of schooling in their lives, in contrast to only 200 in 1800. Behind the women-driven education movement was a continuing movement, again, part of the Second Great Awakening, away from the Calvinist doctrine of original sin. Continued growth of the idea that children were innocents whose character depended on loving potential adults, and women were perfectly suited to that. And Beecher is going to write a very famous book summing up her ideas. Beecher's book was entitled Treatise on Domestic Economy, and it was published in 1841, and it became sort of the standard text for child rearing and housekeeping of the age. You may be familiar with Dr. Spock in the 1950s. Well, it's kind of an early version of that. I should note that Beecher did not believe in the equality of sexes, but with different, women were different, but they were still influential. They may be subordinate, but they were important. And so she was not as radical as many of these other women, which we're going to get into in just a second. Women were not only educated at new female academies in these normal schools. You begin to see women in traditional higher education. Oberlin College in Ohio became the first college in America to accept women in 1837. And this was despite severe criticism that this was a rash experiment that would approximate free love. Critics said it would distract men from their serious studies. Obvious why there was such criticism. Why learn more, academic lessons when women were intended to be at home? Anyway, most American colleges went co-ed in the 1950s and 1960s, and but you do still see occasionally a all-female, all-male college today. Now, as I've just said, a lot of the women like Katherine Beecher were focused on traditionally the women's sphere, and they kind of enculturated the idea that women were important but not exactly equal. Well, there were some activists in the antebellum age which challenged these societal norms more than others, and they actually began to focus on women's rights in a larger context, not just in the women's sphere, traditionally aligned areas, but actually in business and in politics and in things like voting. There were a number of such women activists who focused directly on women's rights, most notably Margaret Fuller. She was a transcendentalist who wrote a best-selling but often criticized book, naturally, called Woman in the 19th Century, and it was published in 1844. She believed women needed not only economic independence, but psychological independence. Let me give her a quote of hers. Quote, "Women need the ability to grow, an intellect to discern, as a soul to live freely and unimpeded. We would have every arbitrary barrier thrown down on every path laid open, and every path laid open to women as free as to men," unquote. Pretty radical stuff. She believed that if society placed women on an equal footing with men, there would be no injustice at all in the world. And she eventually became a leading literary critic for the New York Tribune newspaper. But her career as an activist was cut short when she drowned in a shipwreck at age 40. The peak of the antebellum women's movement came in 1848, when activists called a convention in Seneca Falls in upstate New York. This was the famous Seneca Falls Convention, and delegates there voted on a coherent program for women's equality. Over 200 delegates attended, including over 30 men. The Seneca Falls Convention adopted a resolution patterned directly on the Declaration of Independence. It declared that all men and women are created equal, unquote. It also declared, quote, "The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man towards woman, having its direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her," unquote. It promised to employ activists as traveling agents and to circulate petitions and lobby state legislature and just sort of win as many men allies as they could. Just sort of to keep the pressure on. The leader of the Seneca Falls Convention was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Here you see her as a young woman on the left and then older much later on the right. She had been an abolitionist activist trying to get rid of slavery, but she'd, it had given her a sense of equality, and she'd expanded that sense to include women. The Seneca Falls Convention may not have spurred on too many victories legislatively, but it did help organize a much more formidable movement. After Seneca Falls, there were even more women activists, and they were better organized. The best organizer and activist after Seneca Falls was Susan B. Anthony. She was a Quaker from New York who, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, had first been radicalized in the abolitionist movement and also the temperance movement to get rid of alcohol. She joined the movement when she was 31 in 1851 and became real good friends with Stanton. Anthony organized a network of what she called political captains, all women, one in each of New York's counties. And these captains would spearhead petition drives using county volunteers. Anthony, meanwhile, coordinated an overall program from the state capitol and personally lobbied state representatives. Anthony's major accomplishment, other than creating a pretty formal apparatus, was the passage in New York of laws allowing women to collect their own wages and bring suit in court. That's pretty radical then. Of course, women didn't get the right to vote. It wasn't until 1920, but clearly they were laying the foundations. This concludes the video on reform movements that got spurred out of the early Industrial Revolution.